Welcome to the Stata Introduction tutorial. In this session, I will talk a bit about generating variables. We will focus on the commands generate, replace, and label. Now let's move on to generating new variables. Now, when would you do this? You would do this when creating a variable that is a formula of other variables in your database. Also, you can create new variables when you want to categorize another variable in a different way, and we'll be seeing that later. Now, before we move on to Stata, I want to introduce the commands. Generate is a command that creates a new variable. Replace, it replaces values of an existing variable. Label. There are three distinct flavors of label when it comes to creating a new variable. The first one here, label variable. Now this specific syntax is meant for naming a variable something. Next, label define, it just creates a label. The last one is label values, and that's when you finally attach that label you just created, like yes, no, answer, to the variable of interest. Now let's try an example of generating a new variable together. We will create a new variable categorizing age into two groups. We want subjects younger than 35 years old to have the value of 0, which we will label as young. We will then have subjects greater than or equal to 35 years old as having the value of 1 in this new variable, yet that will be labeled not so young. In Stata, when we have categorical variables, remember that the numbers that represent the categories, such as young and not so young, represent not the numeric value of 0 or 1, but are placeholders so you can tell Stata that they are different groups. An example of a numeric variable is age. In this example here, we are creating a categorical variable, age groups, based off of the numeric variable, age. Now that we're in Stata with our practice data set, I'll guide you through the logic and coding of how to recategorize a numeric variable into another new categorical variable. When generating a new variable, we start with the command generate, or gen, or G for short. So in the command box, you can type G for generate, and we want to call our new variable age groups because we have two groups of ages that we'd like to categorize. So I will just say age groups. This is where you put your new variable name. Now for generate, you must have an equal sign, and I will put the number 0 as a current placeholder. So now that I've entered this, we see immediately in the variables windows that age groups has already been created, but it doesn't yet have a label. That's okay, we can do it later. Let's move on. Now we want to type in the command replace age groups equals 1 if age is greater than 34. Now, what this means is that I want the number 1. Remember, we had two groups in our age groups. We had the young folks and the not so young folks. And the not so young folks, we had the criteria of their ages being 35 or above. We wanted also these not so young folks to have the value of 1 in Stata. So this is what we're telling Stata, replace age groups equals 1. That means before we had this blank canvas of zeros. If you go into the data editor and you go all the way to age groups over here, you can see that when I generated the age groups variable, it made a blank canvas of zeros all throughout. Because they're all zeros, that doesn't help us because we want two groups, not one group. We want the value of 1 to exist to have the not so young group be labeled. Now I said greater than 34 because our criteria was 35 and greater. You can see below that there were no errors because there's no red text in the output, and you can see that 330 real changes made. That means that in the variable age groups that we have, 330 of them were changed to 1. And if we can see that right here, when we open it and we go all the way to age groups, we see that some of them have indeed turned into 1, while the others have remained 0. That's because the people who've turned into 1 were the people who were 35 years or older. Now, this is something that is a good habit to include in your static coding and your variable generation, and this is to replace missings as missings. Let me first type that command out and I'll explain it to you. So type replace age groups equals missing. Now in Stata, in the data editor, a period represents a missing data point. In Stata, they always put a period to represent that the value is missing. Over here, you're saying replace age groups equals period if age, and we have the two equal signs, remember, if age equals missing 2. Luckily for us, 0 real changes made. That means there were no missing ages to begin with. Now, let me summarize what I did here. The period means missings, and if the age of that person was missing, we want that to carry over into the new age group's variables, because in Stata, the period actually gets a high ranking in the numbers. So if we said this age was over 35, Stata will include the missings here. Next, we'll go into our label commands. So this can be in any order you wish to put. This flavor of label will be to label the variable itself. So I will put label var age groups, because that's our variable that we want to name, and I will put in quotes young versus not so young. That is the name I want to give this variable, and immediately over here under label in the variables window, it has displayed the label of age groups. That's if you want to label your variable. Now we want to label zeros and ones, because we might not always remember that 0 meant young and 1 meant not so young. That's why Stata allows you to label your values inside a variable. So you do that by first creating a label. And that flavor of the label command is called label define. So we're going to create a name. We can name it whatever we want. I'm just going to call it young label. Afterward, you are going to define it. So our criteria was that 0 was going to represent the young group, the people who are less than 35 years, and the ones will represent the not so young group, which is represented by the people who are 35 years and older. We see that here, Stata didn't do anything that we can see necessarily, but this label exists in Stata's memory as a label. But it's not, however, it's not attached to anything, because when you look at the data editor and you look at the ages, you can still see that there are ones and zeros. Just because we created the label that defines zeros as youngs and ones as not so young, it doesn't change it in this variable. You have to tell Stata, I want that label to go with this variable. So how we marry and merge the variable to the label is by this command. Label values, age groups, young label. You must place the variable name first, and then you'll put the label name second. So I've just entered that, and I will check on my data editor, and indeed, look, the age groups changed into the corresponding labels, not so young, young, not so young, young. We can also check this by tabbing them. Tab age groups. You can see that instead of having ones and zeros, it has its label, young and not so young. This is great because when you're going through your variables months later, you might not remember all of the coding and the labels that were attached to it. This concludes the tutorial on Stata.